Welcome, Neil. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have a short set of questions for you. Before we get into the questions, though, could you introduce yourself to everyone?
Yes, certainly. My name's Neil Woods. I'm a former undercover police officer from the United Kingdom. So essentially, I used to catch drug dealers for a living. I'm now part of the international movement for drug policy reform as a board member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the United States and also part of the organization in Europe.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get into the questions. We don't have that much time. So you were an undercover police officer for 14 years in the drug crime unit. And after that, you became an active advocate for the regulation of illegal drugs in this organization you mentioned, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is an organization of law enforcement officials seeking to end the war on drugs in exchange for harms reduction through regulation. What was it that made you go from an enforcer of the drug war to an active advocate against it?
Well, I could actually talk for way too long on this topic because there's lots of things that convinced me that we need an evidence-based drug policy. But perhaps the most dramatic example I'll share with you. I was involved in the investigation of an extremely violent, very notorious organised crime group called the Burger Bar Boys in the UK. And I spent 7 months infiltrating them, gathering evidence of conspiracy, and I almost got myself killed. I was stripped at gunpoint. I really felt in fear of imminent violence literally every day of those 7 months. It was very difficult. In order to carry out those operations, I would always manipulate the most vulnerable people in the community, the most vulnerable. I would look for the most vulnerable. And if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. Drugs policing is ruthless. Drugs prohibition is ruthless. It follows the principle that the end justifies the means, that we can cause harm to some individuals or minorities for the sake of the result at the end of the operation. And certainly that was my firm belief, that I could cause harm to those vulnerable people emotionally and by manipulating them in order to catch the gangsters at the end of the operation 6 or 7 months later. Well, for that particular operation, I was looking forward to an extraordinary amount of success because after 7 months, I'd gathered evidence against 96 different people. I knew there were no new people to meet. I'd got every single phone number. I'd been introduced to every single person involved. 6 main gangsters who were involved in organised sexual violence, murders, multiple murders, kidnappings, plus 90 other people who were essentially their support structure and the people that they exploited. So there was no new evidence to get. There was police from 5 different counties, hundreds of officers involved in the enforcement of that. And then just after that operation, I spoke to the intelligence officer who was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground, finding out about the impact of it. And he said to me, yes, we managed to interrupt the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, literally almost getting killed, in constant fear, arresting all those people, all the expense, the extraordinary expense in supporting an undercover operation like that for the sake of interrupting the market flow of drugs for 2 hours. Now as part of my organization, I speak to police all over the world, and I can say with certainty that my experience in that regard is not unique. In fact, it is typical at every single level, street level, regional level, national level, internationally. Wherever drugs policing has a success, a large seizure, a large gang is arrested, it creates a gap in the market. And that's where you get crime increasing through violence and corruption by the growth of monopolies. So that was one of the reasons why I now campaign for an evidence-based drug policy, because having been dedicated to fighting organised crime, I am now dedicated to fighting organised crime by following evidence. And that means reforming our drug policy.
That is a really enlightening story. The fact that you put so much effort into something and the results are so little, it goes to show that when it comes to cracking down on drug crime, going after the supply of it is not that useful. It's the demand that you would have to go after. That's something that we did when it came to alcohol. We went after the demand, so we started regulating, and we didn't just go after the illegal alcohol sellers.
Can I just add a bit of
a
supplementary comment on that? Because you have such a good record of regulation in Finland. In my view, your alcohol regulation is far better than the vast majority of countries. But you're only able to do that because you control the market. Mm-hmm. With the illicit drug markets, police are really good at catching drug dealers. They are extremely good at it. But that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Because police never reduce the size of that market, but they do change the shape of it. They change the shape of it, and that changing shape means more violence, more corruption.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about how the police actually create crime monopolies because they make it so difficult to compete in the illegal market. So big drug gang form monopolies that become increasingly violent, and they actually seek to get more customers and increase the demand instead of reducing it.
Exactly, but I mean the mechanism of policing. Just say, for example, theoretically speaking, there's a group of people or a kingpin character who supplies the heroin in a quarter of Helsinki, and the police have an extraordinary success in bringing down this gang, and they celebrate it in the newspapers. Look at the success we've had. But the reality is that the people who are most able to take up that opportunity created by that policing activity is a gang which controls another quarter of the city. And so the mechanism of policing increases the size of those monopolies more often than not. And that means they have a bigger share of the market, which means they have a larger amount of money to invest in corruption.
Yes.
And this is why corruption from drugs policing is inevitable.
Yeah, and this actually brings us directly to my next question. Since criminals make so much money from the sales of illegal drugs, cannabis being possibly the biggest cash crop, since over 70% of all drug confiscations in the European Union are related to cannabis, and it is by far the most used illegal drug in Finland and in most countries around the world. Now, the former head of the Helsinki anti-drugs unit, Jari Aarnio, was found guilty of being a part of the illegal drug trade. I wanted to ask you, what kind of experiences have you had with corruption caused by the drug market, and how widespread do you think this is in Northwestern Europe, and can we get rid of it with any other means than regulation?
The short answer is no, we can't. The corruption caused by the illicit drugs market is inevitable and unstoppable, and there is no true defense to it. And I'll give you an example of how widespread it is. The kind of work I used to do, I would be loaned by my specialist unit to different constabularies. And before I was loaned to them to carry out a local undercover operation, I would have a team built with specific roles, and all of that team would be called together and they would be given a briefing. Part of that briefing was an instruction that they must not ask me, the undercover operative, my real name. They must not ask me where I'm from. And if they did ask me those questions, they would be disciplined. And they were told that before I even got there. And the operation was cocooned completely separate from normal policing. They were also instructed not to talk to any other police officers at all. It was an entirely separate unit. And that was built in as a systematic structure to protect against corruption that the bosses know was there. The existence of those systems, they wouldn't exist without that corruption being endemic. But even that, it doesn't work, because for one operation, 2 of my backup team went off sick. I got introduced to 2 new police officers. The first one, I shook his hand when I met him in the morning. That was fine. But the second one, I shook his hand and the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. When you've been working undercover for weeks on end, your senses are very fine-tuned. You're very susceptible to even the slightest nuance in body language. And this guy, I just didn't trust him. So I went to the person running the operation. I said, look, boss, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing. I don't trust the guy. And he said, fine. we'll exclude them both so that they don't know what you're doing. They've not been told about the nature of the operation, so we'll exclude them. I didn't think much more of it until 12 months later, when the Bestwood cartel was brought down, notoriously run by the gangster Colin Gunn. And it turned out the police officer I had taken exception to was an employee of that gangster. He'd been paid to join the police, and he was paid £2,000 on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. By the time I met him, he'd been in the police for 7 years. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison by the judge. Now, in the debrief for that with senior officers, what was said to me was, well, Woodsy, we know this happens. We know this is happening. This is why we have these defences against it that don't work. This is why we have these defences against it. With this much money involved, how can this not happen?
Also,
why would organised crime not have employees within the police? Because it's the obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
And the most successful organised crime gangs that survive this Darwinian situation that prohibition has created are the ones who are most effective at the corruption.
Yeah.
So it's unstoppable everywhere, in every country.
Yeah. First of all, that's ridiculous. You've lived like this real world version of The Departed, great movie. But also, what struck me here is £2,000 a month. That doesn't seem like that much money for someone who makes millions off the drug trade. So there's the likelihood of them having more than one employee is 100%. They must have a lot of employees in the British police. And the fact that we had at least one corrupt police officer at the very tip top of our drug crimes unit suggests that that is definitely not the only case. And this corruption comes from the drug trade. There's no other area of crime that can create this much money to cause corruption, and the corruption always goes to the police. I mean, in some countries like Mexico, there's all kinds of government officials. I'm sure customs also gets corrupted by drug crime, but it always is law enforcement, right?
Yeah, you said something that's a very important key issue there. There is no other form of criminality that can pay for that level of corruption. There is none. That in terms of value. But don't forget the point I made about policing, creating monopolies, meaning that people have more disposable income to invest in it. It's not just the sheer value of the money, it's also the mechanism of policing over time is making that corruption more likely. You know, if you were to invest in drugs policing and throw twice as much money into it as you were before, you would arrest twice as many dealers. You would. But the problem would get even worse because you're going to make some people upset, but you're going to make an equal number of people extremely happy at their profits going up.
Yeah, good point. Okay, let's move on. So we had to record this interview beforehand because you can't make it to our Facebook Live on Saturday. But when I'm showing this video, tomorrow, the Finnish Greens will be voting on whether the party will officially support the regulation of cannabis. Currently, the Finnish Greens support the decriminalization of all drugs and a comprehensive study on the effects of reforming cannabis legislation. I wanted to ask, what is your opinion on which is a better way to respond to cannabis in particular, decriminalization or regulation, and why?
Well, of course, I support decriminalisation because no one should be persecuted for the decisions they make in what they ingest for the sake of their own mind and body. You know, I've come a long way from a young cop who didn't care about civil liberties, individual liberty, but now I realise that trying to infringe on that liberty has got us into a major mess. So yeah, I support decriminalisation, but I'm coming at this from a policing perspective, right? I'm still trying to fight organised crime, and decriminalisation doesn't do that because it's still the illicit market. It's still criminals in control of the supply. So, you know, the corruption issues that we've just been discussing can only be tackled by taking that power away from organised crime, by taking back control. But of course, you know, with any commodity that you regulate, look at cannabis. There's a study that came from the seizures of cannabis by Greater Manchester Police in the UK over a 10-year period, and it showed that the average THC content in that cannabis shot up by something like almost 9% by average seizures. So cannabis is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, some people like strong cannabis. I know that. And some people need very high THC cannabis for their pain management, depending on their health problem. But most people, there's also people being surveyed to ask the question, would you have a milder product if you could? And most consumers would prefer to have a milder product, but can't get it because the market is dominated by extremely strong strains of cannabis. And
that would still be the case under decriminalization, because criminals would still control the market. Strong cannabis would just keep getting stronger, right?
Exactly, and it's something called the iron law of prohibition, that any prohibited drug will always get stronger and more dangerous because it's more cost effective for a criminal organization to grow a stronger cannabis, to make the most of the square footage, the square meters of their growing space. It's just about the money. They don't care about public health.
This is the same thing that happened in Finland during the prohibition of alcohol. People stopped drinking beer and wine, and the consumption of illegal moonshine, very strong illegal alcohol, shut up. And with that, all the problems related to alcohol addiction, all kinds of diseases, people going blind, dying of overdose, all that increased.
Exactly, and it's not just the content of the plant as well. You can't regulate the environment in which it grows, and you can't guarantee that it's in a healthy environment. So, for every reason that you would regulate food, you need to regulate cannabis, because you're not going to reduce the customer base. It's not going to happen. The all likelihood, if you look at the data across most North European countries, cannabis consumption has increased, and it's the direction of travel going on there.
Yeah.
The longer you leave it before you regulate, the more power organized crime has. So, alongside cannabis, I would advocate as well for any government should also follow the Swiss model of heroin-assisted treatment, because if you can provide heroin to the most problematic heroin consumers, you're taking enormous amounts of money out of the pockets of gangsters. So heroin and cannabis, you are reducing the likelihood of corruption by huge amounts of money.
I have actually not looked at the statistics when it comes to heroin use in Finland. That's probably something that I should get on. I know that in the United Kingdom, it is a massive and growing problem. Don't you have something like 300,000 heroin users in the UK?
Yeah, we have 300,000 problematic heroin users in the UK. Now, there's also a growing spectre of risk coming, that if some countries don't get a grip of heroin consumption now, create a safe supply for those people who have a problem with that drug through heroin prescribing, then the spectre on the horizon is fentanyl. Because if you look just at the other side of the Baltic, in Estonia, they already have a significant fentanyl problem. And fentanyl, the synthetic opioids, are taking over in various parts of the world, notably North America. But it's also found its way into Estonia. So this is a grim future we can look at if we don't deal with that.
This relates to one other problem. In the UK, synthetic cannabinoids, which are not cannabis, but synthetic cannabinoids made in labs, also called spice. I've heard that in Estonia, there's use of spice, and in Eastern Finland, and spice is an addictive drug that you can overdose on, unlike cannabis. And that drug would not even exist if we would not have had cannabis prohibition. I'm afraid of what will the long-term effects be if we continue down our punishment-driven prohibition approach when it comes to all drugs, but especially cannabis. Now, we're starting to run out of time. So this time has gone by really quickly. It's always fascinating talking to you, Neil. But let me get in one question before we have to end. So the Finnish Greens hold the seat for the Minister of Interior. currently held by our party chair, Maria Ohisalo. She and her possible replacement, when she goes on maternal leave soon, might be listening right now. So if you could give them one final note, any kind of piece of advice on how to handle this issue in their position, what would that be?
Well, what I would say is that the time is right now to take this on. I mean, it's not just in Finland where we have decades of evidence of a failed policy. We can see the trajectory of cannabis consumption. We can see the costs in corruption, and we should be able to see that this is also essentially a child protection issue. So it's about the framing, and now is the time to take this on. So, for example, any politician who is still defending the status quo and refusing to be innovative on this is surrendering the power of the control of this product to organised crime. It's giving in. Deciding to regulate and take control of this situation is taking control away from criminals. And that can be sold to the public. The public in Finland will remember that corrupt police officer. And I would just ask you to also look at the Trudeau messaging in Canada. There is an example where in surveys after the election where the Liberals got power, many of the electorate found that what persuaded them was their messaging around cannabis regulation. So it is a winner if you take it on. And the Trudeau messaging was very simple and very logical and very much in line with what my organisation believes, that this is a child protection issue. And the messaging from his Liberal Party was that we want to stop our children getting involved in organised crime because it's the teenage cannabis market where our young are coming into contact with criminals. And that's where they're getting sucked into gangs. If you look at the example in the United Kingdom, we've got 50,000 odd children who are at the front line of dealing heroin and crack cocaine, and they were corrupted by being in contact with the teenage cannabis market. We shouldn't even have a teenage cannabis market, but we've only got a chance of ending that with control and regulation. But also, where our children do get hold of these products, these strong illicit market products are much more damaging to young brains than they are adults. And the evidence is now the evidence is now clear from Canada and the rest of North America where there is regulation, that regulation reduces young people consuming cannabis. Child consumption is down in every regulated market where they've provided evidence. So this is a child protection issue. It can be sold and framed as much. And I think the time is right because the public are jaded. The public know that this is a failed policy everywhere.
Thank you, Neil. That is definitely starting to be the trend in Finland. We just had a poll recently, and 35% of Finns supported regulation. Half were against it, and the rest did not have an opinion yet. And these were the statistics in the US just a decade ago, and now it's something like only 9% support prohibition in the US. So you're right, we're definitely going that way. And those were some good ways for our party leadership to frame this in the future. Hopefully, our party tomorrow will decide in favor of regulation.
Can I just say that
of course, please.
You will always have the support of Leap Europe in that regard.
Yes, it's definitely very valuable to have the support of people from law enforcement. Unfortunately, in Finland, the leadership of the Finnish police is one of the most active advocates for prohibition and in Finland. And I've messaged with more junior police officers in this country privately, and they cannot speak their mind on this issue, because you would know that the police is a very hierarchical organization, and speaking your mind when it comes to cannabis regulation can put you in a very bad light at your workplace. So that's why this conversation was so valuable. I could not get it's possible that I probably couldn't get a former Finnish drug police officer to speak to me in this way. Anyway, thank you, Neil, so much, and have a very nice weekend.
Thanks. Bye-bye.